You don't survive the city by opening your door to strangers. But when the knock came at 2 in the afternoon, heavy enough to rattle the cheap hinges of her apartment, Tessa didn't have a choice. She looked through the peephole and saw a bespoke suit that cost more than her life insurance payout. He wasn't a cop. Cops slouch. This man stood like he owned the concrete he walked on. She took a breath and unslid the chain. The clock on the dashboard of Tessa's Honda Civic read 3:14 a.m. The numbers flickered, a symptom of a dying alternator she couldn't afford to replace. Rain lashed against the windshield in violent sheets, the worn wiper blades smearing the water rather than clearing it. Tessa was numb. A 12-hour shift at St. Jude's emergency room had drained whatever reserves of empathy she had left. She smelled of cheap institutional coffee, iodine, and the faint, metallic tang of blood that never quite washed out of her scrubs. She just wanted her bed. She wanted the heavy, dreamless sleep of the overworked and underpaid. She took the turn onto Oak Haven Avenue, a desolate stretch of road that bordered the industrial district. The streetlights here were mostly shot out, leaving only the headlights to cut through the gloom. That was when she saw him. It was just a shape at first. A small silhouette huddled beneath the rusted awning of a defunct bus stop. Tessa's foot tapped the brake pedal instinctively, her tires hissing on the wet asphalt. She squinted through the smeared glass. It was a kid. He couldn't have been older than 7 or 8. He was sitting on the wet concrete bench, knees pulled to his chest, wearing a dark blue jacket that was soaked through and plastered to his thin frame. Tessa cursed aloud. The sound was sharp in the quiet of the car. She told herself to keep driving. Call child services, call the cops, let someone else deal with it. She was off the clock, but she didn't press the gas. She looked at the boy in the rearview mirror as she rolled past, seeing the way his shoulders shook against the cold. Cops in this city took an hour to respond to a non-lethal call in this neighborhood. By then, the kid would be hypothermic. She threw the car into reverse. The transmission ground in protest. Tessa rolled the passenger window down an inch. The freezing rain immediately spat into the cabin. "Hey!" she called out. The boy didn't flinch. He slowly turned his head. In the dim glow of the dashboard lights, his face was pale, almost translucent. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead. But it was his eyes that made Tessa's breath hitch. They weren't the eyes of a lost, panicked child. They were flat, calm, utterly empty of fear. "Where are your parents?" Tessa asked, projecting her nurse voice over the storm. Firm, but safe. The boy stared at her. He didn't speak. "You can't stay out here," Tessa said, unlocking the passenger door. "Get in, I'll turn the heater up." For a long moment, the boy calculated. He looked up the empty street, then back to the idling car. Without a word, he slid off the bench, walked to the car, and opened the door. He climbed into the passenger seat, bringing the smell of wet wool and freezing rain with him. He shut the door softly. Most kids slammed it. He didn't. "I'm Tessa," she said, cranking the heat dial. The vents groaned, blowing lukewarm air. "What's your name?" "Leo," he said. His voice was remarkably steady. No trembling. "Okay, Leo. Do you know your address, or a phone number? I can take you to the precinct. They can call—" "No police," Leo said. It wasn't a childish plea. It was a directive. "Take me to 400 Crestview Drive." Tessa paused, her hand hovering over the gear shift. Crestview Drive. It was a private road up in the northern hills, a gated community where the houses looked like fortresses and the property taxes cost more than St. Jude's annual operating budget. It was a 40-minute drive in the wrong direction. "Leo, that's really far. How did you get all the way down here?" Leo looked straight ahead through the rain-streaked windshield. I walked. Tessa looked down. The boy was missing a shoe. His left foot was clad only in a muddy, soaked sock. The realization hit her with a dull thud. He had walked miles in this storm. Something was deeply wrong. A custody dispute turned ugly. Abuse. I have to report this, Leo, Tessa said softly. You're freezing and you're missing a shoe. Someone is going to be looking for you. Leo finally turned to look at her. My father is looking for me. If you take me to the police, the men who left me here will find me first. Take me to Crestview, please. A cold prickle travelled down Tessa's spine. The rational part of her brain, the part that kept her alive and employed, screamed at her to drive straight to the nearest precinct, drag the kid inside, and walk away. But looking at the bruised, soaked child beside her, the nurse in her overruled the cynic. Seatbelt, Tessa muttered, shifting into drive. The drive was agonizingly silent. Tessa focused on the treacherous roads, hydroplaning twice on the flooded highway. Leo didn't sleep. He sat rigidly upright, his dark eyes scanning the side mirrors, watching the headlights of the few cars that passed them. He was hyper-vigilant. When they finally reached the northern hills, the city's grit gave way to manicured lawns and towering oak trees. The road wound sharply upward, ending at a massive set of wrought-iron gates flanked by stone pillars. A security camera with a glowing red lens swiveled toward her Honda as she pulled up. Before Tessa could roll down her window to speak to the intercom, the heavy metal gates began to part, gliding open silently. Stop here, Leo said. Tessa hit the brakes. I'm not leaving you at the gate, Leo. Let me drive you up to the door. No. Leo unbuckled his seatbelt. You shouldn't come inside. It's better if they don't see your car. He opened the door. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the wind was biting. He stepped out onto the pristine driveway, his one bare foot hitting the wet stone. Before closing the door, he looked back at her. Thank you, Tessa. Wait, she said, reaching into her scrub pocket. She pulled out a foil-wrapped granola bar, her dinner, and tossed it to him. He caught it with one hand. Then he shut the door and walked past the gates, swallowed by the shadows of the massive estate beyond. Tessa watched until the gates clicked shut. She threw the car into reverse and drove home, shivering in the damp chill of the cabin. She told herself she did a good deed. She told herself the kid was safe now. She told herself she would forget about it by morning. She was wrong about all of it. Tessa woke to the sound of violence against wood. It was a heavy, rhythmic thudding. It didn't sound like Mrs. Gable from next door complaining about the plumbing. It sounded like someone trying to break the door off its frame. She jolted upright, instantly tangled in her cheap, thin sheets. The digital clock by her bed read 2:10 p.m. She'd managed barely 5 hours of sleep. Her head throbbed, a dull ache behind her eyes. The knocking came again, 3 sharp, deliberate strikes. Tessa slid out of bed, grabbing the heavy metal flashlight she kept on the nightstand. She padded quietly across the scuffed linoleum of her living room, clutching the flashlight like a club. Her apartment was small, cramped, smelling faintly of old books and dust. She pressed her eye to the peephole. Her breath stopped. There were 2 men in the narrow, dingy hallway of her complex. The man standing slightly behind was built like a cinder block, his neck thick, his eyes scanning the corridor. But it was the man at the front who commanded all the oxygen. He was tall, dressed in a dark, impeccably tailored suit that looked entirely alien against the peeling yellow wallpaper of the hallway. His face was sharp, angular, and violently handsome in a way that offered no comfort. His eyes were dark, shadowed, fixed directly on the peephole as if he could see right through the glass and into her skull. Tessa's grip on the flashlight tightened. She knew the faces of gangbangers, junkies, and corner boys. She stitched them up every weekend. This man was none of those. He was the apex predator they all reported to. He didn't knock again. He simply waited. He knew she was there. Slowly, her hands trembling just a fraction, Tessa unlocked the deadbolt and unslid the chain. She opened the door 3 inches, keeping her foot wedged firmly behind it. "Oh, can I help you?" she asked, her voice raspier from sleep than she intended. The man looked at her. He took in her oversized t-shirt, her messy hair, the white-knuckle grip on the doorframe, and the heavy flashlight partially hidden behind her leg. His expression didn't change. It was a mask of cold stone. "Tessa Hayes," he said. It wasn't a question. His voice was a low, resonant baritone that vibrated in her chest. "Who's asking?" she shot back. "My name is Victor Costa," he said. The name meant nothing to her, and the slight flicker of irritation in the cinder-block man's eyes told her it probably should have. "Okay, Victor, what do you want?" Victor didn't push the door. He didn't try to intimidate her physically. His mere presence did the heavy lifting. At 3:30 this morning, a silver Honda Civic registered in your name pulled up to the gates of my home. My son stepped out of it. Tessa froze. Leo. The adrenaline spiked, hot and fast in her veins. "Is he okay?" she blurted out, the nurse in her overriding the instinct to lie and play dumb. For a fraction of a second, the cold mask cracked. A muscle feathered in Victor Costa's jaw. The momentary flash of raw, paternal vulnerability was jarring, before it was instantly buried under ice again. "He is well," Victor said quietly. He had a fractured rib, minor contusions, and mild hypothermia. The physician has tended to him. "Good," Tessa breathed, her shoulders dropping a fraction. "That's good." "Why didn't you call the police?" The question was sharp, accusatory. Tessa narrowed her eyes, her defensive walls slamming back up. "He asked me not to. He said the men who left him there would find him first." She stared Victor down, refusing to be cowed in her own doorway. "Given the neighborhood I found him in, and given that you're standing here instead of a detective, I'm guessing he was right." Silence stretched between them. The larger man shifted his weight, his leather jacket creaking. Victor raised a hand, a microscopic gesture that froze his man instantly. "You took a significant risk," Victor said, his dark eyes cataloguing the peeling paint of her apartment, the cheap locks. "My son was taken from a vehicle 3 blocks from where you found him. The men who took him are dead, but my son managed to slip away during the altercation. He walked for 3 hours in the storm. Had you not stopped, he would not have made it through the night." "So you're here to say thank you?" Tessa asked, her tone dry. "You're welcome. Now, if you don't mind, I have another shift in 6 hours and I'd like to sleep." She moved to close the door. Victor placed a hand flat against the wood. He didn't shove it, but the immovable weight of him stopped the door dead. Tessa glared at the hand, then up at his face. "I do not leave debts unpaid, Miss Hayes," Victor said. His voice was quieter now, dropping to a register that felt incredibly dangerous. "You saved my blood. That requires compensation." He reached into the breast pocket of his jacket. Tessa tensed, her grip tightening on the flashlight, but he only withdrew a pristine white envelope. He held it out through the crack in the door. It was thick. Tessa looked at the envelope, then at Victor. A bitter laugh escaped her throat. "No," Victor's hand remained steady. "It is a token of my gratitude. It will cover a new car, a better apartment in a safer district. Take it." "I don't want your money," Tessa said flatly. "I didn't pick up a kid in the rain for a payout, and I definitely don't want money from a man who sends armed guards to drop off a thank you note. Keep it." Victor tilted his head, studying her as if she were a puzzle he hadn't anticipated solving today. "Pride is a luxury in this city, Miss Hayes. Are you sure you can afford it?" "I can afford to sleep with a clear conscience," she snapped. She pushed against the door again. "We're done here. I'm glad Leo is safe. Don't come back." Victor stared at her for a long, heavy moment. He slowly withdrew his hand from the door. He didn't look angry. If anything, there was a dark gleam of genuine interest in his eyes. He reached into a different pocket and pulled out a small, matte black card with nothing but a phone number embossed on it in silver. He wedged it into the seam of her doorframe. "When you realize that your conscience does not pay your rent or protect you from the dark, call that number," Victor said. He turned and walked down the hallway, his heavy footsteps echoing on the scuffed floorboards. The bodyguard threw Tessa a long, hard look before following. Tessa locked the door, slid the chain, and backed away. She stared at the black card wedged in the doorframe. She didn't touch it. She went back to bed, but the sleep she desperately needed never came. The emergency room at St. Jude's was a war zone on Friday nights. Tessa moved through the chaos with practiced detachment. She checked a laceration in bed 4, administered a heavy dose of Narcan in bed 7, and dodged a projectile vomiting drunk in the hallway. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly, pale yellow hue over the misery. It was 11:30 p.m. She hadn't stopped moving since her shift began. She stood at the nurse's station, charting notes with a cheap ballpoint pen, her mind aggressively trying to stay focused on the mundane. She had left the black card exactly where Victor Costa put it, wedged in the doorframe. She wanted nothing to do with it. She wanted to pretend the knock had never happened. "Hayes," barked Dr. Orris, a grizzled trauma surgeon who looked like he slept in his scrubs. "Gunshot incoming. 10 minutes out. East Side gang dispute, looks like. Get Trauma Bay 1 ready." "On it," Tessa said, dropping her pen. 10 minutes later, the double doors blew open. Paramedics rushed in, wheeling a gurney carrying a young man whose chest was heavily bandaged, bright crimson soaking through the gauze. The smell of copper and unwashed sweat hit the air. 22-year-old male, 2 GSWs to the upper right quadrant, the paramedic shouted over the din. "BP is dropping, 80/50. Lost a lot of blood in the alley." Tessa fell into rhythm, moving to the side of the gurney, ready with the IV lines. As they transferred the patient to the trauma bed, the doors blew open again. 3 men stormed in. They weren't paramedics. They wore baggy clothes, bandanas, and the wild, panicked eyes of men running on adrenaline and meth. The leader, a wiry guy with a neck tattoo of a scorpion, shoved a security guard against the wall. "Where is he? Where's Marcus?" the guy screamed, looking around the ER. He spotted the bloody gurney in Trauma Bay 1. "That's him. Let me through." "Sir, you cannot be back here," Dr. Aris commanded, stepping in front of the bay. The wiry man didn't hesitate. He pulled a heavy black handgun from his waistband and pointed it directly at Dr. Aris's chest. "Step the hell aside, Doc. He owes us." The ER went dead silent. The screaming drunk stopped. The crying child hushed. The only sound was the rhythmic, frantic beeping of the heart monitor attached to the dying man on the table. Tessa froze, her hands gripping a bag of saline. She looked at the gun. Her heart hammered against her ribs, loud and painful. The gunman took a step forward. "I said move." Tessa calculated the distance. She was out of the line of fire, but Ares was dead center. There were no cops in the lobby. They had been called out to a riot down the street. Before Ares could move, before the gunman could pull the trigger, the electronic doors to the ER slid open with a soft, mundane whoosh. 2 men walked in. They weren't wearing baggy clothes. They wore dark, tailored suits. One was the cinderblock man from Tessa's hallway. The other was slightly taller, his jacket unbuttoned. They walked into the chaotic, terrified ER as if they were strolling through a park. The gunman spun around, raising his weapon. "Back the fuck up!" The cinderblock man didn't blink. He didn't even break stride. His hand moved with a terrifying, fluid speed. He didn't draw a weapon. He simply reached out, grabbed the barrel of the gun, forced it upward, and drove the palm of his other hand into the gunman's nose with a sickening crack. The gunman dropped like a puppet with cut strings. The other two gang members froze. The second suit stepped forward, revealing a suppressed pistol tucked neatly against his side, shielded from the view of the waiting room by his body. He didn't point it. He just looked at the two young men. "Leave," the suit said quietly. The two gang members looked at their unconscious leader on the floor, bleeding onto the linoleum, then turned and sprinted out the doors. The cinderblock man casually kicked the dropped handgun under a row of chairs. He adjusted his cuffs, his eyes scanning the room. The terrified nurses and doctors stared in shock. The man's eyes found Tessa. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. He just held her gaze for 2 seconds. A clear, undeniable message. "We see you. We are watching." Then he reached down, hoisted the unconscious gunman by the scruff of his jacket, and dragged him out the sliding doors. The ER remained paralyzed for 5 long seconds before Dr. Ares snapped out of it. "Hayes, push the fluids now!" Tessa jolted, her hands shaking as she attached the saline bag to the IV. She went through the motions, assisting in stabilizing the gunshot victim, but her mind was miles away. She realized then what Victor Costa's visit truly meant. He hadn't come to just offer her money. He had come to claim her. By saving his son, she had stepped into his ecosystem. The black card in her doorframe wasn't an offer of help. It was a brand. When her shift ended at 7 a.m., Tessa walked out into the crisp morning air. The sun was rising, casting long shadows across the parking lot. She walked to her beat-up Honda. Sitting perfectly centered on her windshield, pinned under the wiper blade, was a single, flawless white rose. No note, no ribbon, just the flower. Tessa stood in the empty parking lot, staring at it. The cold reality washed over her, heavier than the exhaustion in her bones. She hadn't just given a lost kid a ride home. She had invited a ghost into her life. And ghosts, she knew, never left you alone. Tessa threw the white rose into the hospital parking lot garbage can. It landed softly on top of a discarded foam coffee cup and a pile of damp napkins. She drove home in silence, the heater barely fighting the morning chill. When she reached her apartment, she finally pulled the black card from the seam of her doorframe. She didn't call the number. She dropped it into the kitchen trash, right over a layer of eggshells and coffee grounds. She wanted her life back. She wanted the mundane, crushing exhaustion of double shifts and late rent. She didn't want white roses or silent men in tailored suits. For 3 days, the universe seemed to comply. St. Jude's was its usual brand of chaotic. Her Honda kept stalling at red lights, and her neighbors kept arguing through the thin walls. Normalcy settled over her like a heavy, suffocating but familiar blanket. Then Thursday arrived. It was her day off. Tessa was at the Spin and Dry on 4th Street, a depressing cinder-block building that smelled permanently of bleach and stale cigarette smoke. She sat on a cracked plastic chair, watching her scrubs tumble in the industrial dryer. The rhythmic thump-thump of the machine was the only sound in the empty room. Outside, the sky was a bruised purple, threatening rain. The bell above the glass door chimed. 2 men walked in. Tessa didn't look up from the worn paperback she was reading, but her peripheral vision tracked them. They weren't there to wash clothes. They didn't carry baskets or bags. They wore heavy canvas jackets despite the muggy humidity, and their boots left wet, muddy tracks on the linoleum. They bypassed the front counter and walked straight down the aisle of machines, heading toward her. Tessa's pulse ticked up. She kept her eyes on her book, her thumb hovering over the page. Tessa Hayes? The voice was gravelly, thick with a smoker's rasp. Tessa finally looked up. The man speaking was thin, his face pock-marked and pale. His companion stood 2 paces back, blocking the aisle. The companion's hand rested casually inside his jacket pocket. "Who's asking?" Tessa said. Her voice was steady, but her grip on the paperback tightened until her knuckles turned white. "We just want to talk," the thin man said, stepping closer. "About a ride you gave a kid a few nights back, down on Oakhaven." The air in the laundromat suddenly felt too thin to breathe. Victor Costa had said the men who took his son were dead. He hadn't mentioned their friends. "I don't know what you're talking about," Tessa said, closing her book and standing up. "I'm a nurse. I take the bus." She grabbed the handle of her laundry cart, aiming to push past them. The thin man clamped a hand onto the wire rim of the cart, stopping it dead. "Don't play stupid, sweetheart. We got the plate numbers off a traffic cam. Silver Honda. We know you picked up the Coaster boy. We just want to know what he told you before he got home." "He told me he liked the heater," Tessa lied, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Now let go of the cart." "The boss wants to hear it from you," the man said. He didn't smile. He reached out, his dirty fingers gripping Tessa's upper arm. His grip was absolute iron. "You're coming with us." Adrenaline, pure and sharp, flooded her veins. Tessa didn't scream. Screaming in this neighborhood only made people lock their doors tighter. Instead, she moved. With her free hand, she grabbed the heavy plastic bottle of industrial bleach resting on the folding table beside her. She swung it in a vicious, short arc, smashing the heavy bottom directly into the thin man's face. Cartilage crunched. The man bellowed, his hands flying to his ruined nose, releasing her arm. Tessa shoved the heavy metal laundry cart forward with all her weight. It slammed into the second man's knees, sending him stumbling backward into a row of washing machines. She didn't wait to watch them fall. She bolted. She scrambled over the folding tables, hitting the linoleum on the other side, and sprinted for the back exit. Behind her, she heard a shout, followed by the terrifying, unmistakable sound of a gunshot. The heavy glass of a dryer door shattered, showering the floor with sparks and shrapnel. Tessa hit the metal push bar of the fire exit, bursting into the alleyway. The humid air hit her lungs like a wet towel. She ran past overflowing dumpsters, her worn sneakers slipping on the slick, grease-stained pavement. She didn't look back until she hit the main avenue, blending instantly into a crowd of pedestrians waiting for a crosswalk. She kept walking, her head down, her chest heaving, until she was 4 blocks away. She ducked into the alcove of a closed bodega, her hands shaking so violently she could barely feel her fingers. She couldn't go to the police. If these men had access to traffic cams and knew Victor Costa's name, the precinct was compromised. She couldn't go back to her apartment. They probably already had her address. She was hunted, a civilian trapped in a war she didn't understand. Tessa reached into her jeans pocket. Her fingers brushed against a small, stiff piece of cardstock. She froze. She had thrown the card away. She remembered watching it fall into the trash over the eggshells. But 3 days ago, when taking the garbage out, she had seen it sitting there, pristine against the filth. In a moment of deeply buried, cynical pragmatism, she had plucked it out and shoved it into her back pocket. She pulled it out now. The matte black surface absorbed the weak streetlight. The silver numbers gleamed. Her pride screamed at her to throw it in the gutter. Her survival instinct told her to dial. Tessa walked to a corner payphone that had miraculously survived the city's vandalism. She dropped in a quarter and dialed the silver numbers. The line rang exactly once. "Speak." It wasn't Victor. It was a flat, professional voice. "This is Tessa Hayes," she said, her breath still catching in her throat. I'm calling the number." There was a 2-second pause. "Location: corner of 8th and Elm, by the closed bodega. Stay off the street, 3 minutes." The line went dead. Tessa hung up the receiver. She pressed her back against the brick wall of the alcove, pulling her jacket tight around herself. She watched the passing cars, jumping at every shadow, expecting the thin man with the ruined face to step around the corner holding a gun. Exactly 3 minutes later, a matte black SUV glided to the curb. It didn't brake hard, it just materialized out of traffic. The back door popped open. Tessa didn't hesitate. She climbed in, pulling the heavy door shut behind her. The interior smelled of expensive leather and faint aftershave. The windows were heavily tinted, blocking out the city completely. In the front passenger seat sat the cinderblock man from her hallway. He didn't turn around. "Drive, Arthur," a voice said from the darkness beside her. Tessa flinched, snapping her head to the left. Victor Costa sat in the adjacent leather seat. The partition between the front and back was raised. He wore a charcoal suit, no tie, his top button undone. In the dim, ambient light of the cabin, his face looked carved from granite. He was holding a crystal tumbler with an amber liquid, perfectly relaxed. "You're bleeding," Victor said. It wasn't an observation, it was an accusation. Tessa reached up and touched her cheek. Her fingers came away, wet. A shard of glass from the shattered dryer door must have grazed her when she ran. She hadn't even felt it. "I had a disagreement at the laundromat," Tessa said, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to sound tough. The adrenaline was crashing, leaving her hollow and freezing. Victor set his glass down in a holder. He reached across the console. Tessa stiffened, but he only pulled a clean, white linen handkerchief from his breast pocket. He held it out to her. She took it, pressing it to her cheek. "They had my license plate. 2 men. They asked what Leo told me. Navarro's men," Victor said softly. The name tasted like ash in his mouth. He looked at the blood blooming on the white linen in Tessa's hand. "Did they touch you?" One grabbed my arm. I broke his nose with a bleach bottle. For a fraction of a second, the corner of Victor's mouth twitched upward. It was gone before it truly formed, replaced by that terrifying cold stillness. "They shot at you?" "Yes." Victor leaned back against the leather. He didn't yell. He didn't issue furious orders into a phone. The silence that radiated from him was far worse than shouting. It was the silence of a man calculating the exact trajectory of a bullet he was about to fire. "Your apartment is no longer safe. Your hospital is no longer safe," Victor said. "They know you are a loose end. They will attempt to tie it." "So what do I do?" Tessa asked, the reality of her ruined life finally crashing down on her. "I have a job. I have a lease. I can't just vanish." "You already have," Victor replied smoothly. "Arthur has a team at your apartment. Your essential belongings are being packed. The hospital administration has been informed you are taking an indefinite leave of absence due to a family emergency." Tessa stared at him, outrage temporarily overriding her fear. "You did all that? When? I called you 10 minutes ago." "I did that 3 days ago," Victor corrected her, his dark eyes meeting hers. "When you threw my card in the trash, I knew it was only a matter of time before Navarro's dogs found your scent. You were too proud to accept my protection voluntarily. So I prepared for the moment you would have no choice. You stalked me. I secured an asset." "I'm not an asset," Tessa snapped, her volume rising in the enclosed cabin. "I'm a nurse. I was just trying to buy groceries and wash my scrubs. Now I'm getting shot at because of your war." Victor moved. It was blindingly fast. Before Tessa could register the shift, he was leaning across the center console, his face inches from hers. He didn't touch her, but the sheer physical presence of him pinned her to the seat. The scent of him, cedar, rain, and something inherently dangerous, wrapped around her. "You are breathing, Miss Hayes," Victor said, his voice a low, lethal whisper. "You are breathing in my car instead of bleeding out on a laundromat floor because of my war." You inserted yourself into this life the moment you opened your car door for my son. You belong to the current now. Stop fighting the undertow." Tessa held his gaze. She was terrified, but she refused to look away. "Where are we going?" Victor leaned back, the oppressive weight of him receding. He picked up his glass again. Home. The Crestview estate was a fortress disguised as a mansion. Tessa sat in a velvet wingback chair in the corner of a massive guest suite. The room was larger than her entire apartment. The bed was a sprawling king, draped in sheets with a thread count she couldn't fathom. The walls were lined with heavy oak bookshelves, and a fire crackled in a marble hearth. It was beautiful. It was luxurious. It was a cage. She had been here for 2 days. She hadn't seen the thin man from the laundromat. She hadn't seen the streets. She hadn't seen her own clothes. Arthur had provided her with a wardrobe of expensive, understated sweaters and slacks that fit her perfectly, which unsettled her deeply. Someone knocked on the heavy wooden door. It was a soft, tentative sound. "Come in," Tessa called out, pulling her knees to her chest. The door creaked open. Leo stood in the threshold. He wore grey sweatpants and a thick woolen sweater. The bruising on his face had faded to a sickly yellow, but he still walked with a slight stiffness on his left side. He held a silver tray with 2 porcelain mugs. "Maria said you didn't eat breakfast," the boy said quietly. "She made tea." Tessa's cynical armor instantly cracked. She stood up and walked over, taking the tray from him before it tipped. "Thanks, Leo. Come sit." They sat on the edge of the massive bed. The tea smelled like chamomile and honey. Leo blew on his mug, staring down at the swirling liquid. He looked smaller here, surrounded by the cavernous luxury of his father's house, than he had in the storm. "I'm sorry," Leo said to his teacup. "For what?" "For making you stop." Leo looked up, his dark eyes, so terrifyingly similar to his father's, meeting hers. "My father says Navarro's men shot at you because of me." Tessa sighed. She set her mug down and turned to the kid. "Leo, listen to me. Grown men making terrible choices shot at me. You are an 8-year-old boy who was walking in the freezing rain without a shoe. I stopped because it was the right thing to do. I don't regret picking you up. Even if you can't go home, a home is just a box you keep your stuff in." Tessa lied smoothly, offering him a small, reassuring smile. "I'll get a new box eventually." Leo studied her face for a long moment, evaluating the lie, before nodding slowly. He finished his tea in silence and slipped out of the room, leaving the door slightly ajar. 10 minutes later, the door pushed open completely. Victor walked in. He wasn't wearing a suit jacket today, just a dark button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, revealing a network of faded, violent scars etched into his skin. He looked tired. It was the first time Tessa had seen him look anything less than invincible. He didn't ask for permission. He walked to the velvet chair she had abandoned and sat down, resting his elbows on his knees. "He likes you," Victor said, staring into the fireplace. "He's a kid. He likes anyone who doesn't treat him like a piece of collateral," Tessa shot back. She stood by the bed, crossing her arms defensively. Victor slowly turned his head to look at her. "Do you think I view my son as collateral, Miss Hayes? I think you view everything as an asset or a liability," Tessa said flatly, "including me." Victor didn't deny it. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek silver lighter. He flipped it open, lit it, and snapped it shut. A restless gesture. "The men at the laundromat are dead," Victor stated. His tone was conversational, as if commenting on the weather. Tessa felt a cold drop in her stomach. She was a trauma nurse. She spent her life fighting tooth and nail to keep blood inside people's bodies. The casual admission of murder made the expensive tea she just drank curdle. "Don't tell me that," she whispered, looking away. "You need to know," Victor insisted. his voice dropping deeper, pulling her attention back to him. You need to know that the threat against you is being dismantled, piece by piece. By killing them, by removing them from the board. Tessa let out a bitter laugh. Right. Clean corporate language. Doesn't change what it is. You sit in this beautiful house, drinking scotch, while people bleed out in alleys and laundromats. And you pulled me right into the middle of it. Victor stood up. He closed the distance between them with slow, deliberate steps until he was standing just inches away from her. Tessa held her ground, tilting her chin up to meet his eyes. Do you think I enjoy this? Victor asked. The cold mask was slipping, revealing a volatile, simmering heat underneath. Do you think I want my son hunted in the streets? My father built this syndicate. I inherited a war. If I show weakness, my men die. If I hesitate, my son dies. He raised a hand, his knuckles lightly grazing the edge of the small white bandage on her cheek. The touch was startlingly gentle compared to the violence in his words. I keep my people breathing, Tessa. I do whatever it takes to ensure they wake up the next morning. You do the exact same thing in your hospital every night. You fight death with scalpels and gauze. I fight it with bullets. My methods are just less sterile. Tessa swallowed hard. Her heart was racing, but it wasn't purely from fear anymore. The proximity to him was suffocating, magnetic. She hated his logic. She hated that, in some twisted, cynical way, she understood it. I'm not one of your people, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. Victor looked down at her, his dark eyes tracing the line of her jaw. His thumb brushed over her uninjured cheek, a possessive, heavy weight. You are now, he said. The hardest part about hiding was the silence. For a week, Tessa existed in a strange, suspended reality. The Crestview estate operated with the precision of a high-end hotel and the security of a military bunker. Meals appeared. Laundry vanished and returned perfectly folded. But the silence was deafening. There were no heart monitors beeping, no drunks screaming in the waiting room, no frantic pages over a loudspeaker. Tessa was a creature of chaos. The quiet was driving her insane. She spent her days pacing the expansive library or sitting in the kitchen with Maria, the older woman who ran the household. Maria didn't speak much English, and Tessa spoke zero Italian, but they communicated in the universal language of chopping vegetables and brewing coffee. Victor was a ghost. He left before dawn and returned long after Tessa retreated to her room. When she did see him, he was locked in his study with Arthur and other severe-looking men. Voices muffled behind heavy oak doors. On the 8th night, the silence finally broke. It was past 2 in the morning. Tessa was in the kitchen, nursing a glass of tap water, staring blindly at the sub-zero refrigerator. The back door of the estate, the reinforced steel one leading from the garage, slammed open with enough force to crack the drywall. Tessa spun around. Arthur stumbled through the threshold. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket. His white shirt was soaked in a bright, glossy crimson that was spreading rapidly across his right side. He was dragging another man, younger, barely 20, whose leg was wrapped in a crude, blood-soaked tourniquet made from a belt. Following them was Victor. His face was streaked with soot and rain, his eyes wild and feral. He carried a heavy rifle by the pistol grip. "Get him on the table," Victor barked, his voice raw. Arthur hoisted the younger man onto the massive marble kitchen island. The kid groaned, a wet, terrible sound, his skin the color of old ash. "Where is Dr. Aris?" Victor shouted to a guard in the hallway. 20 minutes out, boss. The storm washed out the lower canyon road. He doesn't have 20 minutes, Tessa said. Victor whipped his head toward her, seeming to realize for the first time she was in the room. He opened his mouth to order her away, to shield her from the gore, but Tessa was already moving. She didn't see Mafia enforcers. She saw a trauma bay. The cynical, exhausted ER nurse clicked instantly into place. "Arthur, sit the hell down before you pass out," she commanded, pointing to a stool. She didn't wait to see if the cinderblock man obeyed. She stepped up to the kitchen island, shoving Victor out of the way with a firm hand against his chest. She looked at the younger man's leg. The belt was too loose, placed too low. Arterial blood was pulsing in weak, rhythmic spurts onto Maria's pristine cutting boards. "Hold him down," Tessa snapped at Victor. Victor hesitated for a fraction of a second. "Hold him down," she roared, her voice carrying the absolute authority of a woman who wrestled death for a living. Victor stepped forward, pinning the thrashing young man by the shoulders. Tessa grabbed a handful of clean dish towels from a drawer. She ripped the makeshift tourniquet off. The kid screamed as the blood flow surged. Tessa drove the heel of her hand directly into the femoral artery, pressing down with every ounce of her body weight. "I need a real tourniquet, or a thicker belt, and a stiff spoon, now." She didn't look up. Her eyes were fixed on the wound, her arms locking to maintain the crushing pressure. A guard shoved a thick leather belt and a wooden cooking spoon onto the marble. Working with one hand while the other maintained pressure, Tessa looped the belt, fed the spoon through, and twisted. She torqued it until the leather bit viciously into the kid's thigh, twisting again until the bright red spurting slowed to a sluggish ooze. "Tape, something to tie this off," she grunted, her muscles burning. Victor ripped off his own tie, heavy silk, and wrapped it around the spoon, securing it to the boy's leg so the tourniquet wouldn't unwind. Tessa finally exhaled, her shoulders dropping. She checked the kid's pulse at his neck. It was thready, racing, but it was there. "He needs fluids and a vascular surgeon, but he won't bleed out in the next 10 minutes, she said, her voice dropping back to its normal register. Her hands were coated in blood. She looked over at Arthur, who was slumped on a stool, clutching his ribs. She walked over to him, pulling his blood-soaked shirt open. The bullet had grazed his side, a deep, ugly groove in the meat, but it hadn't hit organs. "You'll live," she told Arthur. "Keep pressure on it." Arthur looked at her. The stoic, terrifying enforcer gave her a single, slow nod. A profound gesture of respect. Tessa turned to the sink, turning the faucet on with her elbow. She held her hands under the warm water, watching the blood swirl down the stainless steel drain. She felt a presence behind her. The ambient temperature in the kitchen seemed to spike. Victor stood at her shoulder. He was covered in grit and someone else's blood. The ferocious, cornered animal look was gone from his eyes, replaced by a heavy, burning intensity. He wasn't looking at the wounded men. He was looking at her. He reached past her, grabbing a clean towel from the counter, and slowly began to wipe the remaining blood from her forearms. His touch was firm, methodically cleaning her skin. "You didn't flinch," Victor said quietly, his voice a low rumble over the sound of the running water. "It's just plumbing," Tessa replied, though her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Pipes and pressure. I deal with it every night." "Not with men who bring the violence home with them." Victor tossed the ruined towel into the sink. He leaned in, his mouth inches from her ear. "You are magnificent in the blood, Tessa." It wasn't a compliment designed to flatter. It was an acknowledgement of her nature. He saw her, the grit, the cold pragmatism, the refusal to break. Tessa turned to face him. They were inches apart. The smell of copper, rain, and gunpowder hung thick in the air between them. For the first time since she stepped into his car, she didn't feel like a captive. She felt like an equal. "Just make sure your doctor gets here," she whispered, holding his gaze. "He's here," a voice called from the hallway. Dr. Aris jogged into the kitchen carrying 2 heavy trauma bags. He stopped dead in his tracks, staring at the Mafia boss, the bleeding men, and his missing ER nurse standing at the sink. Hayes? Aris blinked, stunned. What the hell are you doing here? Tessa dried her hands. Picking up an extra shift, Doc. Patients prepped. Let's get to work. 3 days later, the war came to the front door. Navarro was losing territory, bleeding money and men. A cornered animal is the most dangerous kind, and Navarro had decided that if he couldn't win the war, he would simply cut off the head of the snake. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The sky was a brilliant, deceptive blue. Tessa was in the solarium, playing a brutal game of chess with Leo. The kid was a tactical genius, ruthlessly sacrificing his knights to corner her queen. "You left your flank open again, Tessa," Leo said, his small hand hovering over his bishop. Before he could make the move, the heavy oak doors of the solarium burst open. Arthur stood in the frame. He held a suppressed submachine gun tight to his chest. His face was entirely devoid of colour. "Safe room, now," Arthur barked. The estate's silent alarms hadn't even triggered yet. But Tessa didn't ask questions. She grabbed Leo by the back of his sweater, hauling him out of his chair. They sprinted down the long, sunlit corridor. Halfway down the hall, the front of the house exploded. The shockwave hit them like a physical wall. The massive reinforced glass windows of the corridor shattered inward, a tidal wave of jagged shrapnel. Arthur tackled them both, taking the brunt of the glass on his broad back. The deafening roar of the explosion was immediately followed by the terrifying, rhythmic pop of automatic gunfire. "Go!" Arthur roared, shoving Tessa and Leo toward the hidden door behind the library staircase. "Do not come out until Victor or I open the door." Tessa dragged Leo down the narrow concrete steps into the dark. Punching the keypad code Victor had forced her to memorize on her second day. The heavy steel door hissed shut, the locking mechanisms engaging with a series of final, heavy thuds. Inside, the safe room was small, lit by pale emergency lights. It smelled of stale air and cold iron. Banks of security monitors lined one wall, but all the exterior feeds were static. The cameras had been blown wide. Leo was trembling. He sat on the cot in the corner, pulling his knees to his chest, looking exactly as he had that night at the bus stop. Tessa sat next to him, wrapping an arm tightly around his shoulders. "Breathe, Leo. Your dad built this house. It's a fortress." "Fortresses fall," Leo whispered, his voice terrifyingly old. Above them, the muffled sounds of the siege bled through the concrete ceiling. It sounded like the world was tearing itself apart. Heavy thuds, the rapid chatter of assault rifles, the sickening crunches of close-quarters violence. Tessa watched the only working monitor, a feed of the main foyer. Through the grainy black-and-white feed, she watched the nightmare unfold. Smoke hung thick in the air. Bodies littered the expensive Persian rugs. Then Victor stepped into the frame. He was out of ammunition. He threw an empty pistol at the head of an advancing man, staggering him, then closed the distance with terrifying speed. Tessa watched, mesmerized and horrified, as Victor fought. It wasn't the stylized martial arts of a movie. It was ugly, brutal, and desperately efficient. He used elbows, knees, the heavy brass base of a shattered lamp. He fought like a man who had entirely abandoned his humanity to protect what was his. 2 more of Navarro's men poured through the ruined front doors. Victor dropped the man he was holding and spun, but he wasn't fast enough. A burst of gunfire lit up the camera feed. On the screen, Victor staggered backward. He hit the wall hard, smearing blood against the white plaster. He slid down, clutching his abdomen. Tessa stopped breathing. The 2 gunmen advanced slowly, raising their weapons to finish it. Before they could fire, Arthur stepped into the frame from the side hallway. He didn't shout. He just raised his weapon and eliminated both men in 2 precise, ruthless bursts. The foyer went still. Arthur ran to Victor, kneeling beside him. He pressed his radio headset. A moment later, the intercom in the safe room crackled. Arthur's voice, usually a flat monotone, was strained. "Tessa, the perimeter is secure, but the boss is hit. Bad. Dr. Aris was killed in the driveway. Tessa's blood ran cold. Aris was dead. Victor was bleeding out. Bring him to the medical bay," Tessa ordered, her voice slicing through the panic. She stood up, looking at Leo. "Stay here. Lock the door behind me. Do not open it for anyone but me or Arthur." Leo nodded, his eyes wide. Tessa hit the release button. The heavy door hissed open. She stepped out into the smoke-filled hallway. The smell was unimaginable. Cordite, plaster dust, and the heavy, sweet stench of ruptured organs. She ran to the medical suite Victor had built in the east wing. A minute later, Arthur kicked the double doors open. He was carrying Victor fireman style over his shoulder. Arthur dumped Victor onto the steel surgical table. Victor was ghost pale. His shirt was saturated in dark, arterial blood. He was conscious, but his eyes were unfocused, staring at the bright surgical lights overhead. "Where is it?" Tessa demanded, grabbing a pair of trauma shears and shredding his shirt open. "Lower left quadrant," Arthur said, panting heavily. "Exit wound in the back. Missed the spine, I think." Tessa assessed the damage. It was through and through, but it had torn something vital. The bleeding was profound. She didn't have an anesthesiologist. She didn't have a surgical team. She just had Arthur, a sterile tray, and her own 2 hands. "I have to clamp the bleeder," Tessa said, snapping on surgical gloves. She looked down at Victor. His breathing was shallow, his chest hitching. "Victor, look at me." His dark eyes slowly tracked to her face. "This is going to hurt," she said. "More than anything you've ever felt. Arthur, hold his shoulders down." Victor didn't argue. He reached out with a trembling hand, grabbing the steel rail of the surgical table. His knuckles went white. "Do it!" Tessa poured a bottle of iodine directly over the open wound. Victor's entire body went rigid, a guttural snarl tearing from his throat, but Arthur held him pinned. Tessa took a deep breath, grabbed a surgical retractor and a pair of hemostats, and plunged her hands into the ruined flesh of the man who had turned her life upside down. The war ended silently, somewhere between 3 and 4 in the morning. While Tessa was fighting to keep Victor's blood inside his veins, Arthur had dispatched the remaining lieutenants to Navarro's compound. Without their boss, who had died bleeding on Victor's foyer rug, Navarro's syndicate fractured and surrendered before the sun came up. Tessa sat in a plastic chair in the corner of the medical bay. Her scrubs, she had changed into a fresh pair hours ago, were stiff with dried blood. Her muscles ached with a deep, vibrating exhaustion. On the steel bed, Victor was asleep. He was hooked up to 2 IV bags and a heart monitor that beeped with a steady, reassuring rhythm. He looked terrible, pale, hollowed out, the shadows under his eyes looking like bruises. But he was breathing. The clamps had held. The sutures were clean. She had pulled him back from the edge. Tessa stared at her hands. They had stopped shaking an hour ago. She heard a soft rustle of sheets. She looked up. Victor's eyes were open. They were heavy with painkillers, but the sharp, piercing intelligence was still there. He turned his head slowly to look at her. "You're still here," he rasped, his voice barely more than a dry whisper. "Don't flatter yourself. The roads are closed," Tessa replied, leaning back in her chair. A faint ghost of a smile touched his lips. He winced as the movement pulled at his stitches. "Navarro? Dead," she said flatly. "Arthur handled it. The house is secure." Victor closed his eyes, letting out a long, shuddering breath. The tension that had defined his entire existence seemed to bleed out of him, leaving him hollow but undeniably alive. When he opened his eyes again, the cold mask was gone entirely. He looked at Tessa not as a boss, not as a warlord, but as a man who had been stripped down to his marrow. "In the top drawer of the desk in my study," Victor said slowly, "there is a manila envelope. Arthur has the key." Tessa frowned. "I'm not doing paperwork right now, Victor. Listen to me." He shifted, gritting his teeth against the pain. Inside the envelope is a passport, a clean social security number, a deed to a house in a quiet, boring suburb in Oregon, and enough money to ensure you never have to work a double shift again. Tessa froze. The words hung in the sterile air of the medical bay. "The war is over," Victor continued, his voice heavy. "The men who saw your face are dead. You are no longer a target. You don't have to live in a cage anymore, Tessa. You saved my son. You saved me. Your debt is paid tenfold. You are free to go." He broke eye contact, staring up at the surgical lights. "Arthur will drive you to the airport in the morning." Tessa sat perfectly still. She imagined the house in Oregon. Pine trees, quiet streets, a normal job at a normal clinic, where the worst trauma was a broken arm from a bicycle fall. She imagined a life where she didn't flinch at loud noises, where she didn't have to check her rearview mirror, where she didn't have to wash the scent of gunpowder out of her hair. It was everything she had wanted when she was dodging bullets in the laundromat alley. It was safe, it was clean, and it sounded like a graveyard. She looked at the man on the table. She remembered the way he had fought in the foyer, the terrifying, absolute devotion to protecting his own. She remembered the gentle way he had wiped the blood from her arms in the kitchen. She had seen the darkest, bloodiest parts of this world, and she had discovered a terrifying truth. She didn't break under the pressure. She thrived in it. The sterile, normal life was a lie. This room, smelling of iodine and iron, was the truth. Tessa stood up. She walked over to the bed, the rubber soles of her shoes squeaking softly on the tile. She stood over him. Victor looked back at her, his jaw tight, bracing himself for her departure. Tessa reached into her pocket. She pulled out the matte black card with the silver numbers. It was bent at the corners, worn from being shoved into her jeans. She held it up so he could see it. "Oregon rains too much," Tessa said. Victor's breath hitched. His dark eyes searched her face, looking for hesitation, for fear. He found neither. He only found a mirror of his own relentless, uncompromising resolve. With deliberate slowness, Tessa leaned down. She didn't kiss him. She pressed her forehead against his, feeling the heat of his skin, the erratic, suddenly elevated beat of his pulse. "I'm staying," she whispered fiercely against his lips. "But if you ever try to send me away again, I'll unpick every stitch I just put in you. Do we understand each other?" Victor let out a sound that was half laugh, half groan of pain. His uninjured arm came up, his hand tangling in her hair, pulling her closer, anchoring her to him. The grip was possessive, desperate, and entirely absolute. "Understood," he breathed. Tessa closed her eyes, letting the undertow finally pull her under. She had given a lost stranger a ride home, and in doing so, she had found her own. Tessa's choice proved that the most dangerous thing in Victor Costa's world wasn't a rival cartel. It was the woman patching him up. She traded a quiet, exhausted life for a crown forged in blood and loyalty, becoming the unbreakable queen a fractured empire desperately needed. Do you think Tessa made the right choice, or did she just seal her own fate? Let us know in the comments below. If you loved this brutal, high-stakes romance, smash that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe for more intense original stories.